Mud clung to her bare ankles like cold hands, pulling her down into the roots of the old pines. Lyra's lungs ached. Breathing was like swallowing sand. Her wedding dress, 50 pounds of wet, ruined silk, encircled her shins and struggled to keep her in the dirt. Her fingers, numbed, grabbed the hem and ripped a 1.5 feet up the thigh, just to get her knees clear of the mud. Behind her the hounds bayed, deep, rhythmic, louder. Her father's trackers weren't hunting for sport. They were fetching stolen goods for the commander she'd been forced to stand beside at the altar 2 hours ago. When she hit the neutral zone, rain blotted her vision. Her foot skidded on wet shale, and she fell hard, skinning both knees, but she didn't stop to feel it. She scrambled to her hands and knees, one hand to her collarbone. The silver talisman was still there, ice cold against her feverish skin, humming slightly as it chewed on her royal scent. It was the only thing that kept the pack from swarming her exact coordinates. Down the ridge. That was all. If she crossed the line of territory, her father's men would have to stop. They wouldn't risk an open border war with the Western packs over a runaway bride. She kicked her burning legs into a sprint, vaulted a dead log, and plunged into the dark tree line. The hounds were at least a mile behind now. Panic was like old copper in the back of her throat. If they dragged her back again, there'd be no second wedding. They'd force the mating bite then and there, and make her a quiet, broken breeding animal for her father's favorite brute. Then the metal on her collarbone turned white-hot. Lyra gave a gasp and reached for the talisman, and it shattered in her hand. The spell of cloaking fell off. The rain was instantly scented with the cloying, rich smell of an unmated female of the royal line. The hounds went absolutely frantic a mile back. The tone of their barks shifted from search pattern to blood frenzy. They knew where she was going, exactly. Lyra sobbed raggedly and plunged down the unseen slope of the ridge, forgetting her boots, her bare feet skidding on the slick moss. To hell with noise. She tore through a wall of brambles, thorns scratching her forearms, prepared to come down on open ground. But she hit a solid brick wall. It felt like brick, at least. The impact took the wind from her lungs in a sharp huff. She stumbled backwards towards the sheer drop of the ravine's edge, scrabbling for balance. But before she could tumble over into the darkness, a huge, rough, calloused hand clamped on her hip. The ledge could not bear their combined weight. Lyra screamed as the dirt gave way, sending them both tumbling into the ravine. Sky and rock were one in the darkness. Yet the man did not let go. He spun around in the air, holding her close to his chest and pushing her head down under his chin so his shoulders took the brunt of the fall. They smashed into the slope. Rocks tore at his leather jacket as he skidded down the 40 feet of slope, smashing through brittle scrub and loose shale. Lyra kept her eyes screwed shut, braced for the bone-crushing impact of boulders, but he took every jolt. He was taking a blow on his own frame. They flattened out on the bottom of the ravine, rolled twice, and came to rest in the wet dirt. Lyra was under him, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Her heart hammered madly in her ribs. Her eyes opened, and her brain screamed scratch, bite, gouge, anything to get away. She breathed in deeply. Cedar. Dark, heavy amber. It hit her nervous system like a sleeping pill. Her skin burned hot, the screaming panic in her muscles turning to a heavy, sluggish warmth. Her inner wolf whined and lowered its head. Purely instinctive, purely biological submission. It made her stomach turn. Her hands pushed against his chest, trying to clear the fog from her head. He did not move. Hovering in the pitch black, he was perfectly still. Then a low rumbling vibrated through his ribs into hers. "Quit fighting." It was not loud, but the tone was harsh, absolute. The command had enough alpha weight to send a tingle of static electricity up her spine. In the gloom, Lyra blinked and tried to make her eyes work. He was in shadow, the canopy of the forest darkening his features, but she could see the hard, angular line of his jaw, the faint, unmistakable glint of gold in his eyes. Her gaze wandered to his collar. A silver badge was sewn into the tattered leather of his jacket. 2 wolves circling a broken crown. Alpha Caspian, Lord of the West, the most hated enemy of her father. She'd just jumped off a ridge into the arms of a man whose entire pack had a blood oath to kill anyone of her bloodline. She tried to push him off again, but the scent of cedar was overwhelming. Finally she hit an adrenaline wall, and her limbs felt like lead weights. The golden irises above blurred, faded to black, as her consciousness failed. The world was movement and noise as soon as she opened her eyes. Lyra floated in a haze, her head on wet, ruined leather. Her cheek vibrated to the steady rhythm of her walk. Now the scent of cedar and amber was everywhere, wrapping around her and drowning out the sour tang of her fear. One thick arm encircled her knees, the other behind her back, carrying her as if she weighed nothing. Her fingers caught feebly at his coat as she tried to raise her head. Her muscles wouldn't respond. "Put me down," she attempted to say, but her throat was too dry. It was a hoarse whisper. His arm under her knees tightened a little. His pace never faltered. "Save your breath, little wolf," he said quietly. She closed her eyes again to the soft crunch of pine needles, which gave way to the sharp, hard echo of boots on stone. The rain stopped hitting her face, stopped as if she had come under a roof, and a clank of armor from nearby. Someone blocked their way, a low, defensive growl rumbling from them. A voice said from the dark, tight and formal, "Alpha, patrols reported a breach in the eastern ridge boundary. Dog, shall we?" Caspian continued to walk. "Let them howl," he said. "They won't cross the line. Double the guards at the gates." "And the female Alpha?" Caspian did not answer in words. A low, vibrating snarl began deep in his chest, next to Lyra's ear. The guard fell silent, backed away. Lyra felt a chill of dread in her gut. She went from the frying pan to the fire. She'd escaped her father's breeding pens, only to be taken directly to the lair of an Alpha who hated her family. She reached for the latent spark in her blood, for anything to jump-start her nervous system, so she could scramble out of his arms and run. But the sheer density of his aura held her pinned. The mate pull was dulling her instincts, burying common sense under an urgent biological need to stay close to him. His steps stopped. Iron hinges squealed heavily, then oak doors shut with a solid, echoing thud. 3 loud cracks as mechanical deadbolts slid home. "It's shut." Deep in enemy territory, in the private rooms of a rival king, the darkness pulled her down again. The dry heat was the first thing that hit her. It was not the damp, freezing cold of the neutral zone. It was heavy, smelling of hearth smoke and cedar, sinking directly into her aching joints. Lyra's eyes opened wide. She was no longer in the mud. She lay beneath a great velvet quilt on a mattress so soft it made her skin creep. And everything had a smell of him. Cedar, deep amber, sweet, deadly Alpha. She scrambled back until her spine hit the headboard, her breath coming in shallow hitches. No longer was her wedding dress muddy and ruined. She was stripped and dressed in a man's oversized cotton shirt that smelled as if it had just come out of his closet. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through her chest. She tossed the heavy quilt off and swung her legs over the side of the bed, biting the inside of her cheek to ignore the throb of pain in her bruised ribs. Get lost. She needed an excuse, now. The room was a fortress, massive stone walls, heavy mahogany rafters. She ran barefoot to the arched window at the far side. 3 stories down, in the inner courtyard of the stronghold, armored guards moved in formation. She pushed at the bronze latch. Nada. Her stomach lurched as she leaned closer. Solid iron bars were built right into the outer masonry. It was a despair room. It was a cell, and the bed was good. She backed away from the glass, her eyes on the big oak doors across the room. She took 2 steps when the deadbolts on the hall door grated shut. The wood swung back. Caspian entered. He'd lost the ruined leather jacket, swapped for a dark gray Henley that pulled tight over his chest and heavily tattooed forearms. He balanced a silver tray of food in one hand with the casual ease of a man who didn't look like he'd been thrown down a ravine a few hours ago. Turning the lock with a mechanical click, he closed the door behind him. Lyra stomped dead in the middle of the carpet. Her inner wolf perked straight away, wanting to offer submission to his proximity. She did not like it. She dug her nails hard into her palms. The pain of biting her nails would keep her head clear. Ignoring her defensive posture, Caspian moved to a low table near the hearth and set the tray on it. The smell of roasted meat and warm bread filled the room. Her stomach twisted violently, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in 2 days. He turned around slowly, leaning his hip against the table. He saw her bare feet, her rigid stance, her defiance in his golden eyes. You slept 12 hours, he said. His voice was a deep, even rumble. The healers took the gravel out of your back. You've got 2 cracked ribs and some deep cuts, but you're knitting back together fast. Lyra did not speak. She tipped up her chin, denying him the satisfaction of knowing how scared she was. Caspian pushed back from the table and took a slow step toward her. The raw physical presence radiating from him pressed down on the room, pulling the air out of the space. He stood 3 feet away, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. Softly, he said, "I have a lot of patience." He lifted his left hand and opened it, showing her the broken pieces of her silver talisman. "But I won't have liars in my home." He turned his hand and let the pieces of metal clatter down on the stone floor between them. "Well, tell me, why is a stray runaway rogue smelling of the royal bloodline of the man who is currently trying to wipe my pack off the map?" Lyra forced herself to breathe evenly. If his instincts sensed the spike of terror in her pulse, she was dead. If he found out she wasn't just bloodline, but the real daughter of the Tyrant, she went from a trespasser to a high-value hostage. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied. Her voice was flat, practiced, a survival mechanism learned in 19 years in her father's court. "I'm a rogue. I got that amulet from a border guard so I could cross the line without getting torn to bits." Caspian gritted his teeth. A low, warning hum vibrated in his chest. "Don't insult my intelligence." "I'm not," she snapped in return. But instead of backing away from his anger, she took a hard step forward, closing the distance an inch. She acted like prey. He'd treat her like prey. "I was running for my life. You pulled me over the border, and you put me in a cage. If you are going to kill me for smelling like a family I have nothing to do with, get it over with. But don't just stand there waiting for me to ask you to." The air between them was thick with static. The pupils in Caspian's eyes dilated, the blackness consuming the gold of his irises, until all that remained was a thin rim of fire. Her defiance was a direct challenge to his authority as Alpha. She braced for the retaliation, a shout, a shove, the crushing weight of an Alpha command. Instead, his breathing changed. It jerked. It got heavy and uneven. He moved again, closing the distance completely. Lyra had to throw her head back to meet his gaze. His chest grazed the front of the big shirt she wore. With the physical contact came a sudden searing jolt of heat that shot through her nervous system, stealing the breath right out of her lungs. He leaned down, his jaw an inch from her cheek. His pulse pounded, fast and heavy, echoing her own. "You play a very dangerous game, little wolf," he whispered, the sound vibrating into her collarbone. "I'm surviving," she breathed. Caspian looked down. She saw the fire in his eyes trace the line of her throat, hover over the erratic pulse beating there, then slowly descend to her mouth. His face was a blank, naked hunger, and it was terrifying. And worse, her body moved into him, her lips parting on an instinct she couldn't stop. "Damn it," Caspian said, his hands clenching into white-knuckled fists. He jerked himself back, as if he touched a hot iron, and pulled his gaze from her. He took a ragged, harsh breath, his chest heaving as he shoved his wolf down hard. In a split second he turned his back to her, 10 feet of stone floor between them. Before either could speak, someone banged on the heavy oak door. "Alpha," a voice called from down the hall. Caspian ran a hand over his face and rolled his shoulders back until his breathing was even again, and the king returned. A tall man with a brutally scarred face stood in the hall, his beta. "Speak," Caspian ordered, his voice back to cold iron. The beta did not look at Caspian. His eyes stared straight past his shoulder, locking on Lyra with pure, unfiltered hatred. "The trackers at the border didn't pull back," the beta snarled. "An envoy has just arrived at the gates, bearing a flag of parley. They want to see them. They said they are not leaving without their belongings." The walk to the council chambers was a gauntlet. Lyra was marched down the wide, drafty corridors, flanked by the scarred beta and 4 armed guards. Caspian went 10 paces ahead, a solid wall of inscrutable back. Pack members stopped in their tracks to watch them pass. She could hear the muttering. She could hear the sharp intakes of breath, and she could smell the sudden bitter spike of pack hostility. They didn't know her face, but they knew her smell. She smelled of burnt villages and dead relatives to them. They came to a set of huge iron-barred gates. The guards opened them wide, and Caspian marched in. Lyra was pushed in behind him, stumbling on the polished marble before she found her balance. The room was constructed in the form of a pit. 7 elders around a curved table of mahogany on a raised dais, their faces stone. The beta moved to stand beside the oldest member, crossed his arms and glared down at her. She stood alone in the middle of the floor, stripped of everything, waiting for the axe to drop. "You brought a parasite into the heart of our stronghold, Alpha," hissed the eldest elder. His eyes were blind and milky, but his voice whipped through the room. "The envoy at the gate says you sheltered a high-value asset. If she is not handed over by midday, they are threatening full mobilization of their vanguard." "She's a scout," the beta hissed, poking a finger at her. "Look at her. She reeks of the bloodline of the Tyrant. She was sent over the ridge to gauge response times and to map the eastern wards. Our answer to their parley should be to take off her head now and toss it over the gate." Lyra's stomach dropped to the floor. The worst part was, they were perfectly rational. If she sat at that table and looked at decades of slaughter and border raids, she'd vote to kill her too. "I'm no scout," Lyra said, her voice cut sharp and clear through the resounding room. Her gaze locked with the betas. "I was running away from them. If I was a ward mapper, I wouldn't have gone flinging myself down a 40-foot ravine in a 50-pound silk dress." "Shut up," the beta screamed. He threw his alpha fraction voice at her, a vocal weight designed to make lower-ranking wolves drop to their knees. Lyra's knees gave way an inch. Her joints wanted to fold, but she locked her legs and dug her bare heels into the marble. She rose, quivering with the effort, looking straight back at him. The table blew up. The elders started shouting over one another, banging their fists on the wood, demanding her cell, her interrogation, her immediate execution. The sound ricocheted off the stone walls, heavy and oppressive. She shut her eyes. That was all. She'd survived 19 years of her father's brutality, only to be ripped apart in a rival's basement. Enough. It wasn't a yell. It was a low word. One word. Caspian had not shifted from the foot of the dais, but the crushing, suffocating weight of his dominance flooded the chamber, pressing down on every person present until the air grew heavy as water. He moved back 2 slow steps, right between Lyra and the table of the elders, with his big body. He didn't look round at her, but his shoulders completely barred her out of their sight. "Nobody will listen to the envoy," said Caspian. His voice was like ice. There was no room for argument. "Strengthen the eastern ridge, double the guards on the perimeter. Alpha, you can't risk an open border war for a stray," the beta began, stepping forward. "She is not a stray," Caspian interrupted. His voice dropped an octave, vibrating with a dark, ancient authority that made the hair on Lyra's arms stand up. "She crossed into my border. She's my prisoner. Her fate is mine and mine alone. Any one of you here who wants to dispute my claim to her can step down here and try to take her away from me." The heavy iron links between her wrists clanked with every step as the guards dragged her out into the mid-morning glare. Lyra squinted, turning her face from the glare. The dark, damp stone of the council pit yielded to the stronghold's outer courtyard, a blast to her senses. Her shoulders tensed instinctively, bracing for the familiar soundtrack of her father's military camps, the crack of leather whips, the low, wet thud of disciplinary beatings, the sour, ever-present stench of terrified wolves. Instead, she smelled the baking rye and wood smoke. Her eyes blinked in the brightness. The courtyard was wide, extending to the inner walls, but no one cowered. A bunch of kids were screaming and running around a dry stone well. 2 men hammered rhythmically at an anvil by the smithy, shirts off and sweating in the sun, chatting and not bothering to look over their shoulders for a watch commander. It was not a military installation, just a town. The impossibility of it made her head pound. "Keep moving," said the guard on her left, jamming 2 fingers into her shoulder blade. Lyra ignored him, her attention caught by the cluster of people standing near the dirt sparring rings, and Caspian was one of them. He had taken off his dress shirts and now wore only work trousers and a thin tunic of linen, its sleeves rolled back over his forearms. 2 lesser males were arguing heatedly in front of him about what sounded like a disputed fence line. "In your father's court, you raised your voice within 5 feet of the Alpha, and by the time you got out your sentence, you had a broken jaw." They didn't hit Caspian. He didn't even call them out. He just stood there, one leg holding his weight, arms folded across his chest and listening. They were at last out of breath and glaring at each other when Caspian broke in. He put a big hand on each one's shoulder and said something low and quiet. Whatever it was, it just took the fight right out of them. Both wolves nodded, lowered their chins in genuine respect, and walked off together toward the stables. Lyra gazed. The math didn't work in her head. Her dad had drilled into her brain for 19 years that Alpha Caspian was a rabid, bloodthirsty warlord who butchered pups for sport. But the man standing in the dirt, diffusing a property argument like an exhausted village mayor, was not the monster she'd been raised to terrify herself with. Before she could understand the paradox, the guard to her right grabbed her upper arm and shoved her hard between the shoulder blades. "Move your feet, stray." Lyra stumbled over the uneven cobblestones, her bare toes scraping painfully against the rock. The background noise in the courtyard dissolved in a heartbeat. A sudden violent gust of wind stirred the air around them. The scent of cedar and dark amber hit her so hard it tasted like ash in the back of her throat. Caspian hadn't covered the 30 yards. He had closed the gap so quickly she'd not seen him move. He stood before the guard, chest rising and falling a little, his body shaking with deadly uncoiled tension. He did not look at Lyra. His eyes were burning solid, unnatural gold and were fixed on the guard's face. "Take your hand off her," said Caspian. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The guard pulled his hand back as if the leather of her shirt was burning him. He staggered back 3 steps, his boots catching on the stones, his head falling at once to bare his throat in a frenzied submission. "Alpha, I was just carrying out the—" "You've touched what is mine," Caspian interrupted. His voice descended into a guttural register that vibrated the gravel beneath their feet. He took the 3 paces, invading the guard's personal space without raising a fist. "If I catch you putting your hands on her again, I won't be asking why. I'll take the hand on the wrist. You understand me?" The guard swallowed hard, nodding rapidly, shaking from head to toe. Caspian held him in that crushing silence for 3 slow beats before he turned his head. His golden eyes fastened on Lyra. There was anger, still hot and violent, but it wasn't directed at her. It was a fierce territorial possessiveness, something she had never felt from another living creature in all her life. Old dirt and copper, the taste of the sparring ring dust. Lyra wiped an arm across her forehead, stinging her eyes with sweat as she circled the perimeter of the packed earth floor. At last, they put the heavy iron cuffs back on her wrists and changed her rags for a set of light training leathers which let her breathe. Caspian moved after her from the middle of the ring with the heavy, unhurried grace of an apex predator. "You survived 3 days in the neutral zone," Caspian said. His breathing was perfectly flat and no effect of the humidity. "So we know you can run. Let's see if you can hold a line." "Why?" said Lyra, still with her fists up protectively around her ribs. "Want to know if I'm worth feeding before you toss me to your border scouts?" "You gotta know how fast you're gonna get yourself killed when someone breaches the perimeter." "Hit me," she said. She did not wait for a second invitation. She came in fast, throwing a sharp 2-punch combo aimed right at the soft tissue under his ribs and his throat. Caspian blocked both with his forearms. It was like hitting oak beams to hit him. He didn't fight back, just took the hit, his palms redirecting her wrists, forcing her to use up her own energy. "Too much noise in your head," Caspian muttered, catching her left wrist mid-swing and spinning her around with her own momentum. "You're fighting like someone who already knows she's going to lose." "I fight like a woman who expects a knife in the back," she returned. He had her arm pinioned and she twisted it, using his grit as a pivot to lever her body off the ground. She vaulted up, locking both thighs around his thick neck in a scissor takedown. It was a dark, deadly piece of street work. She flung the upper part of her body back into the dirt, expecting to take his 6'3" frame down with her. Caspian didn't move. He grunted as she hit his shoulders, the weight of her falling against him. Before she could break his posture, his big hands shot up to grip her hips and lock her into place. He just stood up straight, with her dangling from his neck like a sack of corn. The sudden physical contact was paralyzing. Her inner thighs were clenched tight about the hot, sweating column of his neck. The thin leather of her hips burned his palms. She was looking straight into his face, 6 inches away. The gold in his eyes flared, the pupils blowing wide, and his gaze locking on her mouth. The density of his scent filled her lungs, making her dizzy. Decent form. His voice dropped into a rough scrape. But you don't have the mass to shove a drop on someone double your weight. I don't need mass, she breathed, heart hammering against her ribs. Her left leg dropped. She snagged his boot at her back and yanked her hips sharply to the right. The sudden change of leverage broke his footing. At last Caspian slipped, and they went down together hard. They crashed to the ground in a heap of limbs and kicked up dust. Instinct kicked in. Lyra scrambled over his chest, pinning both of his wrists above his head, to the ground, and straddled his waist. She leaned over him, her chest heaving, waiting for him to buck her off her. Caspian didn't argue the pin. He only stared up at her, lying there in the earth. The corner of his mouth twitched up slowly into a dark, knowing smirk, catching the light on the sharp edge of an elongated canine. She felt a rush of vindication, and then her nervous system short-circuited. Inside her chest, deep down, the lock broke. A violent rush of dormant energy, the ancestral magic she'd spent half her life suppressing, burst out of her core in a freeze. It was like liquid nitrogen flowing through her veins, rushing down her arms straight to where her fingers locked around his wrists. There was panic in her throat. If that magic crossed the span and touched his skin, the Alpha would feel the vibration. He'd know exactly what was on his chest. Ice water splashed over the edge of the basin and soaked the front of her shirt. Lyra was standing over the sink in her private washroom. Her knuckles turned bone white around the porcelain. She looked in the small glass mirror over the wash basin, her chest going up and down in quick, shallow panics. "Stop it," she hissed through her teeth. "Stop it immediately." She looked at her hands. Her palms throbbed with light. It was not human. Under her skin, the ghostly iridescent blue and silver of her veins swirled along their dark architecture. The air thickened in the small room, a dry static crackling. Gone was the scent of soap and water, replaced by the acrid metallic tang of burnt ozone, something like a lightning strike nearby. She stuck both hands back into the freezing water, trying with all her might to jolt her nervous system into killing the power. It was the worst flare-up in 4 years. She had buried the spirit walker blood so deep, in fear that her father's court shamans would sense it and chain her to an altar as a living battery. But wrestling with Caspian, the heady, intoxicating pull of his alpha aura had been like a magnet. It was pulling the magic from the dark, trying so hard to connect with him. "Get back down," she whispered in a panic, as she pressed her glowing palms against the cold stone bottom of the sink. If anyone in this stronghold knew who she was, she would not leave this mountain. They would not keep her a political prisoner. They would put her in a vault and use her as a weapon to break her father's armies. It would be a case of exchanging one cage for another. The blue light sank back into the bone, slowly, agonizingly. The static in the air died away. Lyra leaned against the sink, a long, shaky breath escaping her lips. Secure, for the time being. The bedroom door behind her clicked its latch. Lyra stopped. No heavy boots had crossed the floorboards, she reflected. She grabbed a linen towel off the rack and dried off the ice-cold water from her forearms, then headed out into the bedroom. Caspian was 5 feet over the threshold. He'd scrubbed the sparring dust from his arms and put on a clean black shirt, but his body was unmoving. His head was tilted up a little. His nostrils flared as he drew the air of the room deep into his lungs. His gaze flicked down to hers. The warmth of the training ring was gone, replaced by the keen, terrifying focus of a hunting predator. "There's a weather front approaching," said Caspian. His voice was too low, too disciplined. Lyra cleared all expression from her face. "I haven't looked out." He walked 2 slow, measured paces toward her. His eyes went from her eyes to her hands, still shaking a little against the damp towel. "Outside the sky's dead clear," he murmured, taking another pace. A cedar smell rolled off him, heavy and questioning. He didn't stop until his boots brushed against hers, and his big frame blocked out the rest of the room. He lowered himself, his mouth just above her ear. "So why does my quarters now smell of scorched ozone and ancient blood?" he whispered, and the sound vibrated straight down her neck. "What are you hiding from me, little wolf?" Her pulse hammered in her throat, irregular and fast. Caspian stepped close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his shirt, his golden eyes searching her face for a tell. If she confessed the source of the ozone smell, that she was a spirit walker, she'd only be trading her father's cage for his armory. But if her lie was bad, his alpha instincts would catch a whiff of deceit immediately. "I couldn't breathe," Lyra whispered. She moved to the side, breaking his physical shadow and wrapping her arms around her ribs. It wasn't quite a lie, her chest still sore from the training ring. "The walls here, too thick. It feels like a safe." Caspian watched her, silent. That sharp, interrogative edge to his gaze did not go away, but softened into something quieter, deadlier. He didn't ask for a better explanation. Instead, he went past her and unlatched the heavy glass doors that led out onto the balcony, pushing them wide to let the cold night draft wash over the room. "Walk with me," he said. Lyra followed him out onto the stone terrace, her damp skin trembling at the cold. From the balcony, a spiral iron staircase descended into a secluded section of the upper gardens of the stronghold. Away from the barracks, down there the air was still. The sharp tang of night jasmine mixed with the constant heavy undercurrent of his cedar aura. Together, they walked along the gravel path until Caspian stopped near the outer perimeter wall, looking down over the dark sprawl of the tree line. "We let in a pack of Western refugees 5 years ago," Caspian said softly. There was no self-pity in his flat voice. "They swore they were running from border raids, hungry, smelled of fear and road dust. We gave them food. We put them in the lower ring quarters." Lyra paused beside him and looked at the hard lines of his face in the moonlight. "What did they?" Caspian's hands clenched the stone parapet until his knuckles were white. "They were no refugees. They were a death squad sent by your northern tyrant. They waited for new moon, broke the defensive wards from within, and opened the postern gate for a raiding party. We lost 50 pack members before the sun was up. My beta took a silver broadsword to the face, trying to cover my blind side." Lyra's breath caught. The venomous hatred of the scarred beta suddenly was all too logical and terrifying. Caspian's obsession with perimeter security was not arrogance. It was the hypervigilance of a man who'd already buried half his family because he'd lowered his guard. "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking out at the dark trees just as he was. "The guy who sent them, he's a butcher. He punishes one error with public flaying. He ensures that the acoustics from the lower dungeons carry right into the courtyard so that every pup in the camp hears what happens when you cross him." The moonlight caught his eyes, narrowed on her face. "How do you know what the tyrant's dungeons sound like from the courtyard?" he asked. Lyra's blood turned to ice. She had fallen. In her eagerness to commiserate with his sorrow, she dropped her guard for a moment and exposed the architecture of her own childhood. Her mouth opened, desperately trying to find a lie about border rumors or captured scouts, but before she could get the words out, a mechanical, ear-splitting wail tore through the valley. The perimeter alarms were wailing. It took less than 3 heartbeats to go from garden silence to absolute pandemonium. Caspian grabbed her upper arm, hauling her up the spiral staircase so quickly her bare feet barely brushed the iron steps. Inside the keep, red emergency lights pulsed, throwing violent, jagged intervals across the stone corridors. The thud of armored feet echoed off the masonry, the vanguards scrambling to their defensive positions. "Stay behind me. Don't leave my back," Caspian barked, dragging her down the central hall toward the tactical command room that overlooked the main gates. Lyra had to run to keep up with his long, predatory strides. Caspian threw open the double doors of the war room, and the sharp, coppery stench of fresh arterial blood hit her so hard she gagged, slapping a hand over her mouth. The beta was already bent over the central map table, his face scarred and distorted with rage. In the middle of the floor stood a runner of the border guard. His chest armor was ripped in half, and a ragged, bloody wound across his shoulder was dripping steadily onto the polished floorboards. "Report," Caspian ordered, his voice dropping into a register that rattled the room. "An envoy, Alpha," the runner gasped, clutching a rag to his bleeding shoulder. "They came up under a white flag of parley. Then they shot 2 crossbow bolts in the chest of Second Lieutenant Vance as he came out to get the scroll. They left the ultimatum of the Sovereign." Lyra's stomach fell. She shrank back into the shadows beside the open doorway, praying to whatever gods were listening that her name wasn't on that parchment. "Read it," ordered Caspian. The runner drew a thick wax-sealed scroll from his belt. His hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled as he broke the seal and read it aloud. The sovereign demands immediate restitution of stolen property, and you're hiding his legitimate daughter, the royal heir to the Northern Territories. You will deliver her intact to the commander to whom she was promised at dawn on the border. If you do not return his property, the sovereign will bring the entire northern vanguard to bear. Will burn your stronghold to ash and salt the earth where it stood. The silence that followed was crushing as bone. The room was filled only with the steady drip-drip of the runner's blood on the floorboards. His daughter? The beta whispered. His scarred face went slack with shock, then hardened to something murderous. They brought verification, sir, the runner said weakly. He reached into his leather pouch and pulled out a handful of stiff, mud-stained fabric and let it fall in the middle of the map table. It was a torn piece of heavy white silk, her wedding dress. Slowly, agonizingly, every single head in the war room swiveled to the shadows by the door, their eyes locked onto Lyra. There was nowhere else to go. The lie lay dead on the table. She wasn't some stray or fortunate border jumper. She was the direct bloodline of the man who butchered their families. You, snarled the beta. The small room was filled with the loud metallic hiss of steel escaping from leather. The beta and the 4 perimeter guards simultaneously drew their sidearms. Short, heavy blades of pure silver. The room's ambient heat spiked. Even from 10 feet away, the nearness of that much exposed silver made the skin on Lyra's forearms prickle and burn. She's the heir, the beta roared. Stepping around the map table, his blade leveled straight at her throat. She's the butcher's brat. I told you. She's mapping the wards. She brought them right up to our gates. Lyra did not blink. She made no appeal, lifted no hands for mercy. She closed her eyes and squared her shoulders, waiting for the cold burn of silver to rip through her chest. It was easy arithmetic. Her father was coming, and the only answer this pack had to a siege was killing her. All her life had been heading for a violent end. She just thought it would be in her father's courtyard, not here. She heard a boot scrape heavily on the boards. She waited for the blow to come. Instead, a deep, guttural growl vibrated through the stone floor beneath her feet. Lyra's eyes flew open. Caspian didn't draw his sword. He had put his whole 6'3" of himself right out in front of the bullets. He stood between Lyra and his men, his wide back a physical wall, completely shielding her from the silver blades. His upper lip was drawn back, fully descended fangs exposed, and his irises had gone solid, luminescent gold. Sheathe your weapons, Caspian rumbled. The Alpha command hit the enclosed room like a physical shockwave, thick and suffocating. The 4 guards on the perimeter buckled at once, going down to one knee on the floorboards, swords clattering harmlessly against the wood, as their wolves submitted to his dominance. The beta was the only one still standing, jaw set, silver blade trembling violently in his grip, as he fought against his king's aura. Alpha, are you insane? The beta shouted, tears of raw, helpless rage welling up in his eyes. She is the enemy. We return her to her mate immediately, and we stop the vanguard. We escape a slaughter. What are you bleeding for a whore from the north? Caspian took a deliberate step toward his second-in-command. The sober, diplomatic leader was gone entirely. His chest heaved, his breathing loud and labored, and his black claws extended from his fingertips, digging into the wood of the map table as he passed it. She doesn't have a mate, growled Caspian, his voice dropping into a demonic, chest-rattling register. His big hand reached behind him, but he didn't turn around. He gripped Lyra firmly by the hip and pulled her flush against his back. Territorial claim, in front of his entire command staff. Alpha, please! I said she stays, Caspian roared. He brought his free fist down on the corner of the mahogany map table with enough force to split the solid wood along the grain. Splinters covered the floorboards. His burning, murderous eyes settled on the bleeding runner who sat on the floor. Send a scout to the eastern ridge, Caspian ordered, his voice dripping cold, absolute finality. Tell the northern sovereign his daughter's mine to command. If he wants her back, he can bring his army and try to take her out of my house. The citadel was a powder keg, waiting for a stray spark to ignite. Lyra leaned against the wall of the courtyard, her arms crossed tightly over her ribs, watching the chaos. The pack was dividing in two. Half the wolves ran for the armory, carrying bundles of iron-tipped spears and heavy timber to reinforce the main gate. The other half were clustered around the well and openly staring at her. They weren't to blame. Her father's army was coming down the valley, and she was the light that guided them. Then a scream went up above the ring of blacksmith hammers. Lyra winced. The heavy oak doors of the medical ward flew open across the dirt. A woman healer stumbled out into the bright sun, her white apron splashed with something thick and tar-black. She dropped to her knees on the cobblestones and clawed at her own scalp, sobbing hysterically. "The nursery!" she screamed, and Caspian ran into the yard and dragged her up by the arm. "What's happened in the nursery? They're burning hot. They're going dark." Caspian asked no questions. He released her arm and sprinted for the ward, his scarred beta on his heels. Lyra's feet moved on instinct, running over the dirt behind her before she could talk herself out of it. She stormed through the clinic doors and collided with a wall of rancid air. It made her gag at once. There were no smells of fever or blood. It smelled like sour milk and old pennies and swamp mud. Dark magic. Her father had not only sent an ultimatum, but his court shamans had smuggled a blood curse over the walls to rot the pack from the inside out before the siege had even started. 10 little wooden beds lined the stone walls. In each one, a child was thrashing wildly against the sheets. Their faces were a fever-dark red and ugly. Inky black veins crawled up from their collarbones, webbing across their throats, choking the air out of them. "Don't touch their skin," the head healer shouted, catching Caspian's wrist as he reached for a seizing 4-year-old boy. "It's acid. It boiled the water right out of our bandages." Caspian halted. His large hands balled to white knuckles at his sides. Never since Lyra had met him had the Western King seemed so utterly frozen. 6 feet 3 inches of muscle, with a broadsword on his back, and none of it meant a damn thing in this room. "I know what this is," Lyra said, sidestepping him. The beta whirled, his scarred face twisted into an ugly mask of rage and fear. He drew his silver sidearm and held the tip an inch from her sternum. "You did this," the beta snarled, backing her toward the door. "When the vanguard strikes, you poisoned the well to cripple our lines." Lyra did not look in his face. She looked at the boy on the bed who was convulsing. "Get out of my way," she said. She knocked the flat of the silver blade aside with her bare hand. The metal seared across her palm with a sharp hiss of burning flesh, but she ignored the sting. She elbowed past the beta's shoulder, dropping every last mental block she'd spent the last decade building, and tore the padlock off her own blood. The moment she let her guard down, the temperature in the ward dropped. The sweltering, swampy heat was replaced by a blast of cold air that smelled of broken ozone and coming lightning. A brilliant blue light iridesced under Lyra's skin, lighting up the dark stone masonry, throwing long, sharp shadows across the stunned faces of the healers. The beta's sword arm dropped to his side. "What in the gods?" he breathed. Lyra didn't bother to answer. She sank to her knees on the hard floorboards beside the closest cot. The boy's lips were turning slate blue. The black curse veins were crawling up his jawline now, closing down his windpipe. "I've got you," whispered Lyra. Her voice reverberated in the small room in a strange harmonic double tone, her own voice overlaid on the deep, ancient hum of the magic. "Don't think on it." She slammed both glowing palms down on the child's bare chest. The pain was instant and blinding. Lyra arched her back, and a sharp gasp tore out of her throat as the dark magic recognized a much stronger, deeper reservoir and jumped ship. The tar-black sludge was seeping from the boy's skin, crawling up Lyra's wrists and arms fast. Like boiling lye, injected straight into her veins. Her muscles snapped tight. She didn't resist the transfer. She pulled it further, trapping it within her own system, then released her spirit light on it. The blue energy surged, enveloping the black venom and burning it from the inside out until it became harmless white ash that drifted off her skin and vanished into the air. The boy on the cot drew a long, shuddering breath. The black marks disappeared from his throat. His color came back at once. Lyra did not pause to rest. She crawled on her knees across the floorboards to the second bed. She caught a little girl by the shoulders, drew the poison to her breast, and burned it out. The acid hit her system again, and she screamed through gritted teeth before crawling to the third cot. Number 4, 5th. Every transfer took a toll on her physical endurance. Static filled her vision, and her ears rang so loudly she couldn't hear the healers above her. "Lyra, stop," Caspian called behind her, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards as he stepped in to pull her back. "It's destroying your nervous system." "Don't touch me," she cried, throwing one hand back to ward him off, the other clapped to the ribs of a 7-year-old. "If you break the conduit, with me holding on to this, it'll go straight to your heart and stop it." She dragged herself to the last bed in the corner. There was a teenager lying there, his chest hardly moving, his skin almost all black. She placed both hands over his heart and drew the vast gathered sludge of the curse right into her own core. Suddenly a blinding flash of blue light exploded through the room. The curse was broken completely. Lyra staggered backwards, her head hitting the wooden floorboards with a dull thud. The iridescent glow drained from her skin, leaving her pale and shivering violently, utterly spent. The ward was silent, except for the quiet, regular breathing of 10 children sleeping soundly and naturally. She pried open her heavy eyelids slightly. The hostile beta was on his knees on the floorboards right beside her. All the hatred and suspicion were gone from his scarred face, and instead was absolute, wide-eyed wonder. The old warrior leaned forward and slowly, deliberately rested his forehead on the floorboards at her bare feet. "A spirit walker," the beta whispered, awe cracking his voice. "The old myths. You really are real." Before she could attempt to sit up, the floorboards were gone beneath her. Caspian gathered her up in his arms and held her to his broad chest, so tightly she could barely breathe. "Nothing," he said, "nothing." He just shoved his face into the crook of her neck, his big body shaking as he carried her straight out of the infirmary. The courtyard was now full of the vanguard wolves. The pack lowered their weapons as Caspian bore her past the central well. One after the other, women and men bowed their heads as she went. She was not the tyrant's daughter anymore. She had just bled for her pups. Caspian ran up the winding stone stairs, 3 at a time, kicked open the heavy oak doors of his quarters, laid her down on the velvet mattress as if she were spun glass. Lyra groaned, rolling onto her side as the phantom ache of the black magic throbbed in her forearms. "I'm here," Caspian muttered. His voice was rough, all kingly composure torn away. He went to the wash basin, wet a clean linen rag in warm water, and sat on the edge of the mattress. The deadly Western Alpha began gently wiping what was left of the dried sweat and white ash from her face, her neck, and her arms, her hands still a little shaky. He wasn't looking at a political hostage or an enemy asset. He was looking at his equal. "You could have died on that floor," he whispered, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her cheek. "Why did you do it? Half this pack wanted you on a pike for your head an hour ago." "They were puppies," Lyra breathed, her face buried in the rough warmth of his palm. "And they're all yours. I couldn't just sit there and watch my father destroy what is yours." Caspian's golden eyes flared with sudden, overwhelming power. Now all his self-restraint was gone. He bent down, and his hand caught in her hair, and he took her mouth. It was not a soft, polite kiss. It was a crash, desperate, bruising, of salt and adrenaline and possessive terror. Lyra gasped into his mouth, heavy arms reaching up to clutch his broad shoulders, pulling his weight down over her. The mate pull, that chaotic, frightening spark for days, ignited between them, grounding her spinning mind to his scent. Finally he cracked, pressing his forehead to hers, both of them breathing ragged hitches. "You're not running anymore," Caspian swore, his voice vibrating against her collarbone. "You are this house now. You are my pack, and I swear to you, Lyra, I'll drown your father in his own blood before I let him lay his hand on you again." Lyra closed her eyes and breathed in the cedar scent of him. For the first time in 19 years, she felt completely unassailably safe. Then the world fell apart. A deafening kinetic shockwave hit the stronghold from below, throwing Caspian off the bed and onto the floor. All the great arched windows shattered inward at the same time, showering the rugs with thousands of razor-sharp shards of glass, and raining pulverized stone from the ceiling rafters. And then the deep guttural wail of the northern siege horns ripped through the valley air. Lyra screamed, throwing her arms up. The front gates were broken through. The butcher was in the walls. A high-pitched, metallic drone whined in her ears, drowning out the sound of the world. Lyra gagged on the cloud of pulverized mortar that filled the bedroom. She could not see 3 feet in front of her face. Heavy hands seized her shoulders, and she was pulled off the mattress. Caspian threw his 6'3" frame over her, shielding her with his back, just as a second impact shuddered through the stone masonry. "Move," he barked. He did not see if she was ready. He yanked her to the threshold. Outside, In the corridor was a living hell. Emergency torches flickered across the white, panic-stricken faces of the vanguard, the air thick with the smell of sulfur, burning cedar, and fresh arterial blood. Caspian passed his broadsword to a passing lieutenant. "Hold the stairs. Don't let them reach the upper ring." He turned back to Lyra, jaw set, but before he could say anything, a hand came out of the smoke and clamped around Lyra's wrist like a vice. It was the blind elder of the council. "The wheel turns," the seer hissed, his milky eyes rolling straight back into his skull, vibrating wildly, his fingers ice-cold against her pulse. It was no longer the voice of an old man, but had a strange grinding resonance that made Lyra's back teeth ache. "The butcher is at the gate, blood for blood." "Let her go," Caspian growled, attempting to wrench apart the old man's grip. "Listen to me," the seer shrieked, not even looking at the Alpha, his sightless eyes fixed on Lyra's face. "The price of the magic. The daughter drains the soul of the father to weld the packs, or the wolf dies before the sun clears the ridge." The words struck her like a blow to the chest. "Suck out the father's soul. If she doesn't gut her own father, Caspian will be dead by dawn." The seer's eyes rolled back and he fell like a stone, hitting the stone floorboards in a dead faint. A collective roar shook the lower floors. Caspian reached for Lyra's waist and pulled her out onto the inside balcony overlooking the main courtyard. She leaned on the stone parapet and felt her stomach drop right out. The heavy iron gates had just gone, blown inwards by concentrated dark magic. Enemy wolves flooded through the breach like black water through a broken dam, devouring Caspian's first line of defense whole. It was not a fight. The defensive wards had not failed. They had been cut. Lyra cast her eyes downward to the broken stones of the gatehouse. The complex protective runes that had been carved into the stone had been physically chiseled away. Someone inside this fortress had smashed their own defenses with a hammer, leaving the front door wide open to her father's army. "Stay here," Caspian ordered. His voice was utterly flat, devoid of anything human. He grabbed a two-handed broadsword from the wall rack. "Stay at this rail." He took no agreement from her. He cleared the stone parapet, dropping 30 feet straight into the middle of the blood-soaked yard to be with his dying vanguard. Lyra clutched the edge of the balcony, her knuckles white as bone. She saw Caspian drop to the dirt, his blade a heavy, deadly blur. For every yard he gained, he was killing 3 northerners, but the numbers were impossible. They were drowning him in bodies. Then the wind changed, and the smell came to her. Old copper, rotten pine needles. Through the smoke of the breached gates walked a tall, heavily armored man casually. It was he, the northern commander her father had made her stand beside at the altar, her runaway mate. He didn't fight in Caspian. He laughed, a loud echoing laugh that made Lyra's skin crawl, and went straight to the doors of the clinic. "No," said Lyra. The commander reached in, grabbed the head healer by her braided hair, and dragged her out into the dirt, pressing a silver short sword to her throat. 3 northern soldiers dragged a half-dozen of the coughing children behind him, the very ones Lyra had just spent 2 hours purging of dark magic. "Hold your blades," the commander roared over the din of the yard. "Drop your iron, now, or the pups gets it." Caspian froze in mid-swing, surrounded by a dozen snarling northern wolves. The courtyard was silent, the only sound the thin, ragged crying of the children. "You think we came for anything but the runaway?" said the commander, sneering, his dark eyes searching the upper balconies until he found Lyra. "Bring down the little royal harlot, and the sovereign will spare the rest of your camp. Keep her, and we start butchering pups right here in the dirt." Lyra's breath hitched. The math was cruel and unavoidable. If she stayed out on that balcony, those kids were dead. She turned away from the guards next to her. But before they could grab her arms, she was running down the spiral stone staircase, away from the safety of the upper terrace and right into the nightmare she had just pulled herself out of. As soon as her bare feet touched the dirt of the courtyard, the northern soldiers were all over her. Lyra didn't fend them off. She held her head high, walked a straight line through the blood and gravel to the commander. "Well, well," he purred, flinging the crying healer to the ground. He stepped into Lyra's space, taking hold of her jaw in a bruising grip that had her teeth biting into her cheek. "You've ruined a very expensive dress, little bird." "Let them go," said Lyra. Her voice trembled, but she made the words come out clear. "Got me there. Tell your vanguard to retreat." "Put her in the iron," he barked over his shoulder. She was cuffed heavily, with icy shackles on her wrists. The inside of the iron was coated with raw silver powder. It bit into her flesh instantly, scorching her skin and locking her dormant spirit magic down into a tight, suffocating knot. Her knees buckled with the pain, but she bit her inner lip hard until she tasted copper, not giving him the satisfaction of a scream. A roar of fury, raw and earth-shattering, split the air across the yard. Lyra whipped her head around. Caspian was fighting like a rabid animal, ignoring his own guard completely. He was taking serious, bloody gashes to his arms and ribs just to continue moving towards her. But the northern soldiers had created an interlocking wall of iron shields and pikes around him, holding him back with sheer immovable mass. "Lyra," Caspian roared, his gold eyes wide with panic. Tears finally slipped over her lashes to sting her dusty cheeks. She gazed at him, the fierce, relentless king who had given her a roof, a pack, and treated her like an equal. "Sorry," she mouthed from the other side of the room. "I love you." She turned back to the commander, swallowing every shred of pride she had. This was as low as it got. She was going back to the breeding pens. "I submit," Lyra whispered, the words ash in her mouth. "Take me to my father. Just keep him alive." The commander smiled. It was a cold, blank expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The sovereign didn't send us down here to negotiate, little bird." He leaned in close so only she could hear. "He sent us to leave a scar." He raised his right arm, his silver short sword pointed at the chest of the healer, who knelt in the dirt. "Kill the hostages anyway," he commanded. Lyra held her breath. It hit her like a falling roof. Submission was deceit. Giving in didn't get you peace with people like this. Her father would never leave Caspian's pack alive. You couldn't reason with a rabid dog. The short sword began its downward swing toward the healer's throat. Lyra watched the silver catch the morning sun. No time to bargain, no time to run, no time to worry about what was happening to her nervous system. She stopped fighting the silver powder burning her wrists. Instead of holding the door against the storm in her chest, she ripped out the deadbolt. The kinetic release was like the firing of a cannon in a closed room. A concussive shockwave of blue light exploded from her skin, pushing the air aside with such force it kicked up a circular wall of dust and gravel. The heavy iron shackles clamped around her wrists not only snapped, but vaporized, spraying harmless smoking iron filings across the dirt. Her forced mate froze, his short sword dropping from his hand. He staggered back 3 paces, his dark eyes bulging with raw animal terror. Lyra was not touching the ground. Her bare feet hovered an inch above the blood-slicked cobblestones, buoyed by the sheer static density of the energy pouring out of her. Her eyes had gone completely white-hot, the air around her so thick with the smell of scorched ozone it stung the back of the throat. "What are you?" he panted, raising his gauntlets to cover his face from the glare. Lyra didn't make a speech. She lifted her right palm and focused 19 years of beatings, cage locks, and breeding threats into one point of concussive force. She blasted it right into his chest. Nothing audible, just a blinding flash and a dull, heavy thud of kinetic impact. His 200-pound body lifted off the cobblestones and flew backwards through the air from the explosion. He tore into the masonry of the lower wall of the barracks, bringing the archway down about him in a shower of pulverized brick and timber. He never got up again. The courtyard was plainly silent. The rest of the northern warriors dropped their shields and stared in paralyzed horror at the glowing, static-wreathed woman hovering in the middle of the yard. A wall of iron shields interlocked and buckled the dirt violently. Caspian pushed his way through the gap, chest heaving, face and armor smeared with black blood and soot. Caspian did not freeze. And while 2 armies stood rooted to the dirt in superstitious dread, the Western King ran straight to the epicenter of the magic. 12 strides and he was across the yard, heavy boots slipping on wet gravel. Lyra's energy whipped around her wildly, sparking off her forearms like stray lightning. She saw him coming and panicked, tried to reel in the power so the static wouldn't stop his heart or burn his skin. She was a weapon of mass destruction now. She was the monster her father had spent her entire childhood warning people about. Caspian didn't decelerate. His golden eyes were wide, but there was no fear in them. He hit her left side, twisting his body and shoving his broad, bloody back hard against her. The very size of him, and the heat of his skin, and the weight of his metallic smell of cedar, mixed with battle blood, acted like a lead ground. The wild sparks around her forearms stopped instantly, her floating heels coming back down to the hard cobblestones. "To the left flank," Caspian roared back over his shoulder. It wasn't a cry for help, it was a general ordering his artillery to fire. The spell of silence was broken. The northern vanguard caught on to what was happening and screamed, rushing forward in a desperate chaotic rush to overwhelm them before she could reload. They fought side by side. There was no pleasant rhythm to it. Then 5 northern infantrymen charged at him with pikes, and Caspian swung his two-handed broadsword in a brutal horizontal arc that sliced through ironwood and chest armor alike. As his swing threw him off balance, Lyra stepped into his blind spot, driving both palms forward to send a concussive wall of blue force slamming into the next wave, tossing grown men backward into the stone well like rag dolls. The acoustics of the courtyard were deafening. The wet ripping of metal and bone, Caspian's heavy grunts of exertion, and the rhythmic explosive crack, crack, crack of ozone detonating in close quarters. She did not turn to look behind her. She didn't have to. He blocked every blade aimed at her back, and she shattered every shield wall that stood in his front. They cut a 30-foot circle of empty, bleeding dirt in the middle of 100 men. The north van started to give way. Soldiers were retreating, falling over their own dead to get away from the blue fire. Then the ground shook under their feet. It was not a structural failure. That was one heavy footfall. The northern fighters in retreat scrambled out of the way, dropping to their knees and bellies in the dirt, baring their necks in frantic submission. The smoke that drifted through the wrecked gatehouse parted. A monstrous pitch-black werewolf entered the yard. It was tall like a draft horse, its shoulder muscles bunched under matted, blood-caked fur. Its eyes burned with a sick yellow toxic light, and the heavy suffocating stench of rotting pine needles wafted over the courtyard, choking out the smell of ozone. At last, her father had gone out to the field. The black beast didn't even bother to leap, and then it shifted mid-step, bones popping and realigning with a sickening wet crunch, until her father stood in the dirt in his human form. He was massive, 7 feet of knotted, scarred muscle swaddled in thick black wolf furs, his jaw thick and misshapen from old border wars. "A parlor trick," her father spat. His voice was like 2 millstones grinding. He stared at Lyra's glowing hands with absolute unadulterated disgust. "Flash and noise, you think that changes who you are? Get you down to the cellar with a chain about your neck, little bird." He reached over his shoulder, unhooking a massive, double-bitted iron battle-axe and pressing the jagged edge right to Caspian's chest. "Step up, boy," her father rumbled, putting all of his alpha weight behind the command. "Come bleed for my property." All the old laws of their kind said that an alpha's challenge on open ground was absolute. Blood for blood, king against king. Caspian's fingers tightened around the hilt of his broadsword. His jaw clenched. He shifted his weight, ready to step outside their protective circle and take the blow. Lyra walked faster. She moved in front of him, bare feet firmly between Caspian and the northern sovereign. Around her forearms the blue light flared, buzzing with a sharp, angry vibration. "No," said Lyra. She didn't scream, but the spirit magic stole her voice and carried it across the bleeding yard, vibrating against the stone walls with a weird, layered resonance. She looked right into her father's toxic yellow eyes and didn't blink. The frightened, stuttering girl who used to hide under the floorboards when his boots echoed in the hall was dead. "You don't get to touch him," Lyra said, stepping deliberately into the open dirt. "This is not a border skirmish, and you're not battling a rival king today. You're fighting me." Uneasy murmurs rippled through the northern ranks. A female challenging a ruling alpha for territorial dominance didn't just go against tradition. It was biologically unheard of. At that, her father threw his head back and laughed dryly, barkingly. "You dare challenge me?" he snarled, stepping forward, his huge shadow looming over her. "You have no land. You haven't got a council. You're a stray, a nameless runaway with no pack to back your claim." Behind her, heavy steel clanged loudly on the cobblestones. Lyra looked over her shoulder. Caspian had dropped his broadsword to the dirt. The lethal, unbowed king of the Westlands drew back, folded his massive form, and dropped to one knee on the bloody stones just behind her. He bowed his head, intentionally exposing the soft skin of his nape to her back, the last irreversible pose of complete submission. "She's not a stray," Caspian said. His voice was an even iron rumble that reached the back of the gatehouse. And she speaks with the voice of the whole Western pack. There was a heartbeat of stunned silence. On her right, the scarred beta unbuckled his sword belt, dropped it to the dirt, and knelt. 3 lieutenant commanders ducked behind him, then the perimeter guards, then the healers standing on the steps of the clinic. 200 Western wolves, like a wave moving across the courtyard, dropped to their knees in the blood and gravel, and bowed their heads to the woman glowing in the center of the yard. They gave her their authority, their turf, their power, for free. Lyra turned her head back to her father. The blue fire in her eyes flared bright enough to cast double shadows across the dust. "I'm up for your challenge," she said. The Northern Sovereign wasted no breath on another threat. He roared in the depths of his throat, a sound that shook the mortar of the gatehouse, and crossed the 30 feet between them in 3 giant, earth-shaking strides. He swung the double-bitted iron axe vertically, aiming straight for the center of her skull. Lyra didn't bother to block 200 pounds of falling iron. She dropped her weight, her naked knees pressing into the wet cobblestones, and slid under the swing. The heavy axe head chopped the air and crashed into the stone floor where her boots had been a moment ago. Yellow sparks and chips of rock rained down on her shins as the kinetic impact shattered the masonry. But before he could wrench the blade from the stone, Lyra pushed both palms in the dirt and pushed her upper body off the ground. She spun around in midair, kicking the bare heel of her foot across the jagged line of his jaw. The physical hit barely budged his neck, but the concussive discharge of spirit energy that accompanied the kick hit him like a battering ram. He stumbled 3 steps to one side, his heavy black wolf furs steaming and smoldering where the blue light had seared the leather. "Coward," he cursed. He wiped a smear of dark arterial blood from his mouth. His toxic yellow eyes narrowed. "Dancing in the dirt, hiding behind Western skirts. You ain't nothing without a pack to bleed for ya." Lyra said nothing. The old childhood script, the words that used to freeze her lungs in the middle of his camp, didn't even register. Her mind was silent. "I'm not running," she said. Her voice rang with a double tone that ricocheted off the barrack walls, vibrating in the teeth of every wolf in the yard. "I'm putting you down." She moved within his reach and fired short concussive bursts of blue energy at his kneecaps and breastplate. Her father grunted, taking the kinetic shockwaves on the chin with pure biological mass, and swung the heavy axe in wide horizontal sweeps that tore jagged chunks out of the stone pillars behind her. He wasn't trying to outmaneuver her. He was throwing his entire 7-foot frame into a battle of attrition, waiting for her nervous system to burn out. She ducked a crossbody swing that would have taken her head off at the neck, and set her back foot to drive a heavy blast straight into his solar plexus. She had miscalculated the length of his left arm. He let go of the axe handle completely. His great rough hand came clear through her blue light and clutched her by the throat, like a collar of iron. He lifted her off the ground by her windpipe. Lyra choked, toes scraping the cobblestones. He held her in an unbreakable grip, crushing the cartilage of her throat. "Think a little blue spark makes you an alpha?" he snarled. He brought her face close enough to smell the rancid pine and stale blood in his breath. "You're breeding stock, little bird. You've always been just that." He hurled her body onto the cobblestones. Lyra's head struck the rock with a dull, sickening thud. Vision blacks out, air hissing from her lungs in a ragged gasp. Her shoulders ached as she rolled off the ground to see her father advancing, the heel of his iron-plated boot coming down squarely on her sternum. The weight made her flat against the dirt. He bent his right hand down, took hold of the axe's leather shaft there, and pulled the heavy blade free of the cracked stones. He loomed over her, dwarfing the sky with his shadow, and lifted the iron above his shoulders to finish it. Lyra looked up to the rusted edge of the falling blade. Her pulse was absolutely flat. Her blood had no panic left in it. She reached up with both bare hands, ignoring the handle of the axe altogether, and pressed her blowing palms flat against the thick leather armor over her father's heart. The daughter welds the pack's emptying the father's spirit. The grinding voice of the seer echoed in the back of her head. Lyra shut her eyes. Instead of sending her spirit energy out in a kinetic blast, she reversed the polarity. She opened the conduit in her chest and turned her own body into a perfect vacuum. The axe fell 6 inches short of her face. The heavy iron weapon slipped from her father's numb fingers, clattering harmlessly against the cobblestones at her ear. The northern sovereign gasped, wet and ragged. His huge hands fell to her wrists, clawing frantically at her skin, trying desperately to pull her glowing palms from his chest. But the magnetic pull of her own bloodline kept her locked on. "What, damn it!" he choked. The deep, vibrating alpha timbre in his voice cracked and thinned out to a weak rasp. Lyra pulled. She reached through the bone and yanked the ancient, poisonous root of his wolf right out of his marrow. His leather armor was oozing with a heavy vapor, black as tar, and straight into her palms. This time it did not burn her veins. Her spirit magic was a high-voltage ground, reducing the foul, heavy sludge to harmless white ash the instant it touched her skin. Her father shouted. It did not sound like a wounded warrior. It was the shrieking existential panic of the apex predator being violently ripped of its claws. He visibly sagged across his broad shoulders with thick, corded muscle. The oppressive weight of his alpha presence lifted from the air of the courtyard like fog before the sun. The toxic yellow fire in his irises flickered wildly, faded and was snuffed out forever, leaving him with the dull, watery brown eyes of an aging, exhausted man. Lyra opened her eyes, watched the man who had owned her whole childhood shrink under her hands. She took hold of the very bottom of the conduit and ripped the last hanging thread of the wolf from his soul, sealing the break forever. The black vapor ceased to flow. The bright blue light drained from Lyra's hands and went back into her own skin. Her father fell back on his knees. He clutched his chest with shaking, liver-spotted hands, gasping for air, staring around the blood-soaked yard with wide, confused eyes. The awful northern warlord was no more. There was an ordinary human male, frail and weak-kneed, with a bad jaw. He dropped to his side in the dirt, curling into a ball, sobbing with the hollow, open-mouthed grief of a man who'd just lost an arm. The silence in the courtyard was complete. Then there was a great clatter from near the well. A northern infantry officer cast his iron shield on the gravel. He looked at the weeping old man in the dirt. Then his eyes went to the breathless woman, sitting in the shattered stones. The old warrior sank slowly to his knees, deliberately, lowering his forehead to touch the blood-stained cobblestones. A second northern soldier threw down his spear, then platoon leader. The archers on the broken wall. 200 northern soldiers lay on the dirt, all over the ruined yard, their heads bowed in total, unconditional submission to the sovereign who had broken their king without spilling a single drop of his blood. The adrenaline eventually cleared from Lyra's nervous system. Her spine liquefied. She leaned back, and the edges of her vision went black as the gravity took over. She missed the rocks. 2 heavy, calloused arms lifted her from under the shoulders. The familiar warmth of cedar and dark amber filled her nose, drowning the ozone in old blood. Caspian pulled her up against his wide chest, burying his face deep into the hollow of her neck. His breath was ragged, his heavy frame shaking against hers. "I've got you," Caspian muttered into her skin, lifting her off the dirt. "I'm right here." The mid-morning sun sliced across the valley, illuminating the dust motes floating above the lower ring. Lyra leaned against the stone parapet of the command terrace, peering down at the front gates. At dawn, draft horses had dragged the broken iron portcullis out of the way. Now the entrance was just a broad, open stone arch. There was no one at the perimeter checkpoints. The border runners had been called back. The boundary was just dirt again. The pack was down in the yard working around the clock to clean up the wreckage. Northern armorers were receiving anvils from western blacksmiths, forging replacement hinges for the barracks doors. 12 hours ago men were trying to kill each other, and now they were unloading a wagon of grain from the northern ridge into the storehouses. A knot of western pups were playing tag with a handful of northern kids who had come with the supply carts, their laughter echoing off the masonry near the dry well. It didn't look like occupied territory. It looked like a town getting ready for winter. Heavy, familiar footfalls on the stone patio behind her. Lyra didn't look back. She leaned back as Caspian moved forward, letting her shoulder blades press against the broad, solid wall of his chest. His arms encircled her waist, and he held her loosely against him. He rested his chin on the top of her head and drew in a slow, deep breath. "The Northern Council elders just signed the integration papers," Caspian growled. The deep vibration of his voice resonated straight down her spine. No lines contested. All the northern ridge is flying your banner. Lyra reached down, her fingers on the rough calluses of his knuckles, hooking her thumb into the loop of his belt. It will take time, she said, watching a northern soldier help a western mason hoist a heavy timber beam in the yard. They are still looking over their shoulders. So were you 3 weeks ago, Caspian said softly. His hands on her waist, he turned her in the circle of his warmth. She looked up into his eyes. At last the dark, tired circles that had bruised the skin under his eyes since the siege had begun were fading. The paranoid hair-trigger tension that used to hold his shoulders in a permanent guard was all gone. His eyes were always shining with a golden light. He raised a large hand, his thumb wiping some dried stone dust from her cheekbone, and tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You didn't just save this house, Lyra, Caspian said softly, his eyes falling to her mouth. You have broken a 50-year cycle. We were all just waiting to die in that dirt until you pulled yourself over the ridge. We broke it, she corrected. She stepped into his chest until there was no space left between them. I just got out of a breeding pen. If you'd not stepped in front of me when your beta drew his iron, I couldn't have pulled any of it off. The corner of his lips slowly curved into a familiar smirk, the sunlight catching the sharp point of his canine. He bowed his head and kissed her. Not the desperate adrenaline-charged crash in the clinic, but a slow, deep possession, with the heavy, undeniable weight of forever. The mate pull had begun as an invasive, terrifying fever in the dark of a ravine, but settled deep into her marrow, quiet, steady, and all her own. Lyra closed her eyes, inhaling the warmth of his skin and the fresh scent of cedar. She had ripped the ruined silk dress to the knee a month ago, and run through the mud expecting a rabid warlord waiting in the trees to finish her off. She had found her equal, her pack, her anchor to her own power. Caspian's arms pulled her against his body, pinning her to the stone terrace, as the sounds of their joined pack echoed up from the valley floor. She used to think crossing the border was losing her life. She never knew it was the only way to conquer the world.